Hello and good morning, everyone. We'll wait a couple more minutes for people to arrive and then we'll press on. Can I just check, Chris, that people can speak if they wish to?
Yeah, there's no people can mute, but people can also unmute if they want to speak.
Very good. Where are people calling in from? I'm in the Chilterns in the UK, just outside London.
What's
Uh,
I'm in Clontarf in Dublin.
Hello, Ronan.
Hello.
Good to see you again.
Greenwich, hazy Greenwich for me.
Yeah, it's a cold one this morning. I think we're in a good place to start. We've got a fair number of people online, and others, I'm sure, will catch up when they join us. So, Chris, do you want to say a few words, and then I'll move on with the presentation?
Yeah, welcome everybody. This is the fourth webinar we've given from Offshore Wind Learning. Bit of a gap between this and the third one, but we are intending to keep them going. So the purpose of these webinars is to just give an update to the industry globally, and then provide opportunity for questions and discussion. And in the invites, we invite people that have made progress through about halfway through the course, so completed about 4 modules, and ask them to propose questions. So we've got a good bunch of questions that we can get through. But first of all, Alistair's going to give us a little presentation, just a sort of an industry and market update.
I'd suggest that you open the chat, and I can see a number of you already have. So we've got people calling in from Aberdeen, Copenhagen, Copenhagen, Grimsby Docks, Stirling in Scotland, and Brussels in Belgium. So that's very good. So if you have any questions, if you could pop those in the chat, and then we'll moderate those later. So, something to set the scene. Offshore wind, you know who we are, and we're aiming to get 1 million people into offshore wind. Next slide, please. This is the latest forecast from about June last year, so we'll see another one later this year as to the next 10 years of offshore wind installations. So these are per annum installations, not total. And you can see healthy growth. Now, you should be cautious about the orange lines in the next few years because that's North America. So I think they haven't updated that yet. But we're confident that the market will come back because the fundamentals are there. Europe looks good. And after a bit of a hiatus when the prices changed, certainly the UK, Germany, uh, Denmark, Netherlands have understood that and are adjusting their tender schemes accordingly. You can also see that China just keeps racing ahead. They really get it, and with a planned economy, they do what they say they're going to do. It's great that they are charging ahead because it helps the overall market as it evolves with technology and everything else. Then other parts of Asia start kicking in. I mean, at the moment we have Taiwan, but Philippines, Vietnam is looking more rosy than it was, and you start to get Japan and others coming in. Um, so a good, healthy growth ahead. I'm sure we'll have some hiccups, but it's a good place to start. And if you use these sums, we don't quite get to 1 million, we get to 700,000. I don't think we need to argue about the scale. It's a lot of jobs needed around the world. Next slide, please. And if we just take the technician demand, this is from a slightly different data set, and not reaching quite so far out, but you do get the jobs go with the installations pretty much. And as I say, this is just technicians, so which are very, very important, as you can imagine, but there's a whole load of jobs that hang off the work in the field, and that's one of our modules, explains the range of jobs involved. So pretty much there's something for everybody. Next slide, please. And with this challenge, Chris and I decided to put together Offshore Wind because we couldn't see anybody was doing anything about the sort of 10 years ahead, you know, including how do you work with schools. Some of those kids are going to be in offshore wind in 10 years' time. And learning from previous work I'd done on e-learning for clients, we've put together, and most credit actually goes to Chris. He did all the hard work to work out all the software, capture his 20 plus years of knowledge in offshore wind, and he's made it really fun and engaging, but you probably know that because you're on the journey. And really important for us was that, yes, there's training out there, 3 days classroom for about £2,500, but we're trying to attract people in, which is why we have a price of £100. And it seems to be working. We just need to get to about 10,000 people if we're going to cover it, but it's working. Next slide, please. And the feedback that we're getting, in fact, is humbling. You see a paragraph at the top. One of our partners, not only do we have Energy Institute, IMREST, WFO, and a few others. One of them is Ocean Energy Pathway, which is a spin-off from GWEC that I was involved in its very early days. And they have bought now 280 courses for governments to not only teach them offshore wind, but it's a great way for them to build a relationship with those governments. And then we've got individual students who've given us one-liners which are glowing as well. So it seems to be working. Next slide, please. And what we've seen recently is not just individuals, but we're seeing companies and organisations buying in bulk, we call it. And it's across the industry, which is exactly what we want. And in this setup, we're able to include a thing called Seat Manager, which allows the companies to monitor the progress of students and give them a nudge here or there to get through to completion. And we're seeing a lot more people completing as well. So that part of it is working. Next slide, please. One of the important recent events, so it was 14th of January, there we are, oh, it's on the slide, was allocation round 7. Many of you will know, but just for clarity, the UK uses a system of auctions, which they call allocation rounds. We've just completed the 7th. And in that, the projects bid in as to how much they would want for the electricity for 15 years, I think it is. It might even have gone up to 20, but
20.
Yeah, it's 20 now. That they would be prepared to build their wind farm if they were to get that steady price. And it is proved to be one of the most, probably, no, the most attractive structure. It's what we call a contract for difference. It means that electricity companies get a steady price across the project, which de-risks one of the big components of their investment. In this case, we got 8.4 gigawatts in total. We understood that about 25 gigawatts of projects were eligible. Don't know how many of them actually bid. That's not public knowledge. And what was great was not the government had put a certain amount of money by, a budget, to be able to buy some of the projects. And then when they saw what they call the bid stack, the different prices being offered, they said, well, hang on, these are really good prices. They were, if I recall, using a price of £94 per megawatt hour as their sort of general look ahead, and therefore they doubled the budget to get more of the offshore wind. That is a vote of confidence like no other. Allocation round 7 granted something like 6 and a bit gigawatts, whereas allocation round 5 didn't get any because the government hadn't factored in construction prices, particularly steel, had gone up. And the same problem happened in Germany and Denmark, where they got 0 bid rounds. But the governments have understood the industry wasn't fibbing. They really are a lot more expensive until those prices come down, but they're still very good value from a government point of view. You can see that floating offshore wind projects are still considerably more than fixed. There's a big debate in the industry as to will floating projects come down in price to match fixed, and that sort of economies of scale. I'm happy with either. It would be great if we can have floating because it increases the global available market by a factor of 5. And it was nice to see that the projects were successful around the country. Next slide, please. And one of the things I did was to look at the years when these projects are coming off. So this is still allocation round 7. We currently have 16.6 gigawatts operating. That's as of end of last year. I think we're up at about 18.3 in current day, with a lot under construction. And then you add allocation round 7, you get to 36.7 gigawatts. In our metric, that's 73,000 jobs. So the UK is definitely a good place to be doing offshore wind, as are lots of other countries, particularly in Europe. But as you also saw, Asia is a place to go. And what we've seen is that people learn their craft in Europe and then head off to Asia to get more senior jobs in all the projects out there. So it can be, if you want it to be, an international career. But what I like about this graph is that so some of these projects are built over 2 or even 3 years in terms of when they come live. And when you do the maths on that, you get the graph that we have, and the different colours are different projects, just for explanation. But that too, the supply chain is quite an even distribution. And if you, I haven't done the maths, but if you add in allocation round 6, that's even better. And what we want is that steady growth so that people will build factories, employ people, and all of that. So this is good news. After, as I say, a couple of years of pain, we're starting to see really solid market growth. And that obviously means a good thing for jobs. Next slide. I think it might be at the end. There we are. Okay, that's a bit of a run round. Chris, do you want to add anything?
No, I think it's a good quick summary of where we're at, particularly the good news in the UK. I think it's fair to say that before the results of AR7 came out, there was a lot of anxiety in the industry as to whether offshore wind was still going to work in, the second largest market and the largest market in Europe. And we've seen a tricky few years that we've talked about on these webinars before about challenges globally for offshore wind. So I think it's fair to say there was a sort of collective sigh of relief when the results of AR7 came round. And I know it seems like a very UK focus for the presentation, but really it did demonstrate that a number of things are still viable, so like large scale offshore wind projects delivering at at huge, significant scale. They're over 8 gigawatts of allocation in the core markets of offshore wind is still very viable. So in time, that will stabilize the Western Europe market. I think we'll see similar good news coming out of other European markets, and offshore wind will be in a more stable position to grow globally again.
Yeah, and I've had people in Japan, Australia, Philippines. They've noticed allocation round 7, and or AR7 as the shorthand is. That has given them more confidence. So we shall see in the next year, but we're quite positive about the state of the market now. Okay, shall we do without the slides and move into some of the questions?
Yeah, so we had a bunch of questions that were circulated as part of the meeting invite, and so we have prepared a little to go through and answer those questions. We are still very happy to take questions from attendees. So if you want anything particular to discuss, anything in particular, then just pop it in the chat, or if you're comfortable, just raise a hand and ask it. And so we can deal with those questions, and we'll do a little bit of a mix so that we get the best of both worlds. And we have a first question from Jeff. Is there any floating offshore wind operating in the UK market currently? Yes, there is. There's a few sort of demo projects in the UK that I think the largest one is 3 or 5 turbine Kincardine project off the east coast of Scotland. That's been operating for a few years now using semi-submersible floaters, and I think 8 megawatt or so machines. So we do have the demonstrator. There's a number of demonstration projects around the world for floating. What we don't have yet for floating is an operational commercial scale project. There are a few of those in development. The one I think to keep an eye out for is the Greenvolt project, again, off the east coast of Scotland. That's 400 megawatts, so clearly in commercial scale. And that won its CFD in the previous allocation round, AR6. And under the rules of the CFD, you need to spend a certain amount of money at a certain milestone early in the sort of construction phase. And that milestone for Greenvolt is around the middle of May. And so we will get a steer from whether or not Greenvolt achieves the milestone delivery date payment, which is about 10% of total capex, or like major contracts signed effectively. So it's a measure of, is the project really committed? Have they managed to secure full financing, reach financial close, and start the construction of the project? So yeah, certainly from my perspective, close attention to the news around Greenvolt in the middle of May.
Just to add to that, the other notable project in the UK is Hywind Scotland, which is different technology. These are spar buoys rather than semi-submersibles, built by Equinor. That's the old Statoil company, and it's been a huge success. In particular, the capacity factor, they were recording 57%, which is quite a lot more than we've seen in other offshore wind projects. And that's part of the blessing that floating wind has, is you can go deeper and therefore further from shore and get better winds. So we shall see how this plays out in other markets, but UK is actually in a very good position to a leading edge of floating wind, but we've got a whole load of other people want to get there, Japan particularly, who will as soon as we get to commercial scale at good numbers, start to multiply the market considerably.
Okay, let's take a question from the pre-supplied questions next. So the question was, due to the inflation, how has the installation cost per megawatt increased in recent projects, and has the composition of costs changed? So effectively, this refers to the sort of economic shocks that materialized post-COVID and post the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which created three kind of issues for the industry. One was higher commodity prices, one was supply chain disruption, and the third was high interest rates, so inflation. And those aspects sort of combined together to create almost a perfect storm of impact on the capital cost of offshore wind. So there's various metrics that have been put out there in terms of what average cost per megawatt was before and what it is now. And it depends, of course, if you're looking at sort of Western European costs, or if you're looking at Chinese costs, their capex are very differently for those two major offshore wind markets. But it's fair to say that the capital cost probably increased by about 30% is a good number. So I think what we had in the course actually as a sort of a ballpark figure for capital cost per megawatt was 3 million a megawatt. And I think we've upped that to sort of close to 4 million per megawatt now. So that's the step up that those not just inflation, but those three sort of economic factors had on the market. I think, the supply issues were really focused on the main components, turbines largely, but also foundations, also vessels, day rates for vessels was affected during that period. The financing, the cost of financing is a clear driver of overall cost of offshore wind. So because it's such a high capital cost upfront and then relatively low operational costs throughout the operational life, offshore wind is very exposed to financing costs. And again, there's an interesting piece of analysis that was done, which we present in the course, where you can, if you change the cost of capital from say 10% down to 4%, which what happened in the UK during the 2010s, the total impact of financing on the overall cost of energy, the levelized cost of energy, goes down significantly. So it's very sensitive to the capital costs. So it's the second part of that question is the sort of composition of cost. It's still turbines being your main component, your main spend, your main contract. So the turbine supply agreement is likely to be 35 to 40% of your total contract value. And so obviously it's exposed to those supply side issues, steel prices affecting the turbine suppliers, of which is quite a small market in Europe and a much larger market in China. And so they are still, those costs have gone up, but they're, I think, a similar large share of the overall picture. There has been the sort of impact on foundation costs and installation costs due to the same drivers has also increased. But what we've also seen during the period is the increasing size of turbines. And one of the key things just to be aware of about the larger turbines is that you have fewer of them for the same capacity. So there is a downward force on cost associated with moving to larger turbines, because installing a 10 megawatt turbine takes about the same time as installing a 15 megawatt turbine. So for a 500 megawatt project, you have fewer installations, and so the installation time is reduced, which reduces cost. So there's a sort of even though there's been upward pressure on those aspects of offshore wind, there's also downward pressure due to the technological changes in the industry.
Just to add to that a little bit, I remember, so £3 million per megawatt was a good sort of average. And then we saw that go down a bit. I saw projects at 2.6. Then as those costs increases came through, I saw some projects at over 4 million. But I'm now seeing them coming back down again. How fast? I'm not going to make a forecast, but it's the industry is moving in the right direction. Should we take a question from the chat, Chris?
Yep.
What is the situation with the infrastructure bottlenecks around the world? For example, shortage of transformers.
Well, I don't know actually about what the recent changes of that are. So I can give you an answer in terms of general terms over maybe like the past 12 months from talking to people that do this on a project basis, and really it's a case of having to order well ahead of when you will need delivery. So it puts a time pressure on the construction. Because the lead time for transformers is, or certainly was around 12 months ago, around 2 years. So you will be wanting your transformers at that point, or if not a bit earlier in your construction schedule. So from when you reach financial close. So it just puts a lot of time and scheduling pressure on those things, and you need to be able to commit upfront to making those purchases. And we are sort of in a period where we talk about a buyer's market and a seller's market, and over the past few years we've been in a position where this has been a seller's market, and so the supply chain are able to demand additional things from the buyers, from the developers, in terms of like down payments, early upfront payments to secure your manufacturing slot and things like that. Now that's challenging, but one of the effects it has is that basically means only the very largest developers can manage that kind of requirement. And so it's a sort of squeezing out of smaller developers. And what we've seen is, now only the very largest organizations, and there's a few very large and experienced developers that are successful in offshore wind. And it's very, very difficult for the smaller developers with maybe one project or a smaller project to have those supply, like long-term supply relationships. So it favors the likes of RWE, Ørsted, SSE, some of the larger manufacturers in European industry. Excuse me, I'm going to cough.
Very good. I'll cover whilst you cough. Let's take another question from the pre-set of questions. I like the one about Australia, if you don't mind. I'll talk to that one. Fascinating market. I was lucky enough to advise the Australian government for about 5 years on setting up the market, and really drove home the message of keep it simple, make it attractive, and the industry will come to you, which they did. I have to say, of all the governments I've worked with, they have been the most enjoyable. They just do stuff. So, for example, the projects were set at 700 kilometres squared, which is about 2 gigawatt size projects, which the industry at that time very much liked. Also, that the administration costs would be very low. Because it's a new market, it makes sense to do it that way, whereas you see much more mature markets like the UK and the US, where the leasing costs are substantial. So they got all of that right, and it was at a time when the industry was looking to go into new countries. Australia's a nice, stable market in its wider sense. So the developers loved it, and off they went, got themselves some projects, and everything, I think 12 projects were let, and everything was looking rosy. Then we had all this price increases, and it also caused disturbances, particularly then the US being difficult with its projects, and the industry moved into a phase where it's been consolidating its pipeline of projects. So that was a major effect. And companies like Ørsted, one of the biggest, had really burnt their fingers. And when I say burnt their fingers, sort of £800 million write-downs. And you saw some of the other players taking that message. Let's not go too fast, too wide, and why don't we just pause in Australia? And then there's been one of the fundamentals I put to the government was you need a national target. And the way that Australia works, and you see the same in the US and Canada and a few other places, is that I'll call them states, Victoria, New South Wales, and on all of those, they have a major part in the market. And then there's a federal government which also has a role. And the federal government doesn't like setting targets. It didn't do it for solar, didn't do it for onshore wind, so why should it do it for offshore wind? And that hasn't changed. But you started to see, well, the first state, Victoria, set a target of 9 gigawatts by 2040. That's a good number for a state, but it would need perhaps 2 more states to come up with targets, which they have been in discussion, but I haven't seen anything announced. So that just weakens. If you haven't got a target, then you're unlikely to be putting together auction rounds for electricity, and all of these things connect. So after the enthusiasm, you are seeing some projects going, nah, this isn't the right time to be here, and they've handed back the keys on those projects. But I'm confident, again, the fundamentals are there. Australia will be a great market, and it can spin off from the advances in Asia as well. It's just going to take a bit longer than they were initially hoping. So, excuse me, somebody's decided to call me just now. Over to you, Chris.
Well, we'll let Alistair finish his sort of narrative about the Australian. Are you ready to come back, Al, or do you need to deal with it?
I'm back, but I don't have a lot more to say about Australia. But I don't think the uncertainty in the USA directly has involved it, in terms of just market confidence. It's just this retrenchment by the developers, because their stakeholders are saying, it's great to see you advance, but how about making that steady growth? And you're seeing people like RWE really doing a great job. They've got a steady strategy, and they're implementing projects at scale. They're now the ones to watch, I would say. Enough on Australia.
Okay. Another one from the list that we received. Which tech/hard skills are recommended to get a project engineer role for tier 1 companies, especially if coming from another sector? I mean, this is quite a difficult one to answer, because we are not recruiting for those roles. So it's just based on sort of knowledge of what we've seen in the industry, and if you look at certainly look at the signposting course and peruse the job boards, which will give you an indication of this. But really it's about the sort of engineering fundamentals. If you're an engineer, an electrical or a civil or a mechanical or a marine engineer, then they're the sort of like core hard skills that are going to give you a good starting point. Offshore wind is quite different from anything in other sectors, but the skills that you will be experienced on with having worked as an engineer in another sector, I think will be valuable. And as the industry is expanding, you're not competing always with people who have offshore wind experience, because the industry needs to grow and pull in people from other sectors. We sort of make this point in the course about the soft skills, and just I would make that again. Things like interface management, things that like risk management, things about knowing how to work in a safe manner, to deal with scheduling and project programs and things like that. Those sorts of softer skills are really come through as being the valuable ones. If you've worked in big projects, big construction projects, then you're going to have a lot of that sort of softer skill understanding, and that's really valuable because there will be new learning that you need in offshore wind, and I think employers understand that. There are, for specific roles, there are specific training courses. So we flagged the GWO training. That's kind of like the standard training, and there's a whole load of courses there that would get you up to speed in specific disciplines, and there's something to look at also. The other thing, I guess, perhaps just there are offshore wind standards now coming into play, and guidelines for certain pieces of work, and HSE practices that is worth just reading up on, because they give you a sort of a sense of this kind of attempt to turn offshore wind into a more standardized approach to doing work, and the skills required to do it. Okay, I'm going to move to another question from Jeff about do the Chinese turbine and foundation suppliers currently have a presence in the UK/European market? The short answer, really, I would say, is not really. In terms of turbines, I don't think there are any Chinese turbines used offshore, certainly not in the UK, and I don't think anywhere else. So if there are very small numbers. Foundations have been tried a little bit more, and have a sort of a slightly greater penetration, but it's still small numbers. It's not really a presence at this moment. If you look in the news, there is talk of Mingyang, which is one of the larger Chinese turbine manufacturers. Lots of talk with government about setting up a factory in Scotland. So that's one to watch. That would be the first sort of big footprint of a Chinese developer, a Chinese O&M moving into Europe. So it's an interesting one, because it looked like they were starting to make a move towards the European market, and their likely ability to deliver at lower cost is attractive, given that we had these upward cost pressures. But we are also now, we have to recognize in a sort of geopolitical cycle where protectionism is paramount, and we're starting to see by European rules playing out in Europe. And I had a discussion with a leading developer and turbine package manager a few weeks ago, and asked them the same question, and they said it's not happening. We're not going to be buying Chinese anytime soon. So I think the current geopolitical situation has meant that for Western European markets, perhaps there's less likelihood of Chinese turbines getting established with a reasonably strong presence in the near future. If you look outside of Western Europe, it's pretty clear that Chinese manufacturing is likely to be very prevalent in new markets. Two reasons. One, it's closer to a lot of new markets around the world. China already has a presence in a lot of these markets, more so than it does in Europe. And it's I've lost my train of thought. There was another reason why China is going to be in emerging markets. It will come back to me, but I think we'll see that in places like Philippines, Vietnam, possibly even India. That we'll see Chinese manufacturing getting a greater position in those markets.
Chris, I've just posted a link to a useful document, and it gives details not just of jobs but also people profiles, what skills you would need to do that. And one of them is for a project engineer. This is from Star of the South in Australia. So this would be a project engineer in a developer rather than project engineer in supply chain. But you get the message. People happy to look through that and get a bit more information. Okay, what question should we go for next, Chris?
I'm just going down the list, to be honest with you. I'm just conscious of time. We've got about 15 minutes left before we want to wrap up. So I'll just perhaps come through some of these more quickly. Job opportunities for candidates outside the EU, America, and regions where offshore wind projects and activities are going on. So I think the key here is to look at where emerging offshore wind markets are active. So we can see that in Colombia we've had the first auction and a project in the process of winning and starting to be developed. So there will be job opportunities in Colombia. Brazil, although it doesn't have its first project yet, there's a huge amount of work going on preparing for it. It could be a very large market, so I think there will be good job opportunities in Brazil in the near term. Philippines has an auction live at the moment, or about to go live this month, and to sort of complete by sort of August, September time. So depending on the outcome of that auction, there will be job opportunities flowing from it. So they're the sort of markets that immediately spring to mind as places where there isn't any offshore wind at the moment, but they are on the cusp of it, and there will be job opportunities coming there.
Well, I would also add to that Japan, where there are the early projects, and one of my friends has moved out to Japan just to work on developing. He's a wind resource specialist, essentially a statistician who's learnt about wind. And we're also seeing South Korea coming alive as well. So a number of markets, but then the other is that it says job opportunities for candidates from outside the EU will come to the EU. It is incredible the diversity of people that I've worked with over the years who have amazing skill sets, but they did have to move to where the work was. So I would encourage people to do that, get your skills, and then you can take them back home if you want to.
Okay. Next one is about impacts of climate change on current offshore wind areas. Will it impact on future development? Are current areas threatened, or will new areas emerge? I think the answer to this is that probably on the projects themselves, there isn't that much of an impact. The sea level rise is not of a magnitude that is likely to have an impact on offshore wind at all. Ports maybe, but I don't think ports generally are prepared for sea level rise anyway. So those aspects I don't see as major issues. Some of the things that will change are more extreme weather events, maybe greater wave heights, and wave climates that would need to be considered as part of engineering the foundations and the structure. There's been a study done in the last couple of years where they compared the Met Ocean conditions in South Africa with Met Ocean conditions in mature markets, particularly actually in Scotland, because there was a concern about potential offshore wind in South Africa. Would the wave climate be too great for these projects to survive? And the comparison really was quite interesting in that actually, the wave climate in Scotland is pretty extreme, and that's where projects have already been built. So we have already kind of designed offshore wind to be able to cope with these kind of pretty wild extreme events. And so it was seen that actually there wouldn't be an issue for other markets. And I think because of that background to the industry, which has occurred in quite a sort of an extreme area, it shouldn't be an issue for designs to accommodate any changes from climate change. One, I guess, slightly more interesting one is changing wind regimes. So obviously offshore wind is very, very sensitive to how windy it is, and operation, I was talking to somebody the other day who was saying, actually the data is suggesting that these projects will have a lifespan of maybe 30 to 35 years from how they are behaving under existing sort of wear and tear. Previously, it was like 20 to 25 years. So there's a sort of a feel that there might be an extra 10 years of operational life on these projects, which is really good news for the industry. Shows that they are operating well. But what it does also mean is you've got to think about 30 years ahead, what would the wind resource be? And I think there are some risks around climate change about potentially changing the climatic scale effects of wind, which is something for, I guess, a concern for operational teams and asset management teams to make sure that they understand the risk of effectively lower wind speeds affecting projects. But yeah, I generally, from an engineering perspective, I don't think there's an issue with climate change. It's more from an operational, like, revenue perspective. Shall we continue? Any more questions come in? Just checking.
Nope.
No. Okay. So latest regulatory policy developments in Europe. I guess what we're seeing is a number of things. One is kind of a bit of standardization in approach towards the contract for difference across a range of markets. That wasn't always the way it was done. And I think that is a benefit. There's a lot of variety when you look at how offshore wind is done around the world. And reducing that variety reduces risk and uncertainty for industry players, and actually the contract for difference has some flexibility within it anyway as to how it can operate, but just having that as a basics foundation for managing revenue streams, I think is a good standardization. We're also starting to see things like the introduction of non-price criteria becoming more prevalent. So these are things like when projects are awarded to a developer, the awarding body wants to understand what the developer is going to do for the environment, for social things. So projects are awarded not just based on cost, but based on environmental and social considerations that they're prepared to commit to. And I think this is a valuable thing for the industry. It does add an extra cost, and it does add an extra layer of complexity that developers have to deal with. But it does also crystallize some of the benefits associated with offshore wind, which aren't always visible unless they're documented in this way.
The other thing I'd add, excuse me. The other thing I'd add, coming back to the UK, is government is putting in place a lot of supportive money, frankly, to help grow the industry, to help people transition from oil and gas into offshore wind, or to build factories. So, and I'm confident the same thing's happening in Denmark and Germany and Netherlands and such. So there is this constant government support, which tries to flex as the market changes. But one of the reasons that the UK has been so successful is the government has been supportive for 28 years. Even though we've had changes of government, they may have sped it up or slowed it down, but that stability is so valuable to the market.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've done Australia. So, we've got a new question. Ireland. We actually have an expert on Ireland on the call. I don't know, Ronan, do you want to step in and answer the question in the chat? I'll start a work. Oh no, we are there.
Sure.
Hello, Ronan. There you go.
Hi, Alistair. Hi, Chris. Hi, everybody. Let me just scroll down to I would be interested to know your opinions on the progress with offshore wind in Ireland. That's possibly a loaded question. But what I'll say is those of us who are looking at offshore wind and looking at supporting its development in Ireland, we're all aware of the ambition that's been set out. For anybody else here who's interested, to just hear what our targets are. 5 gigawatts by 2030. It's 2026 now, and we have 0 gigawatts. So that one's probably at peril. But we also have double down on that in the Powering Prosperity policy statement that was issued last year, and that calls for 20 gigawatts by 2040. So a 15-year timeline, massive ambition, and of course the consenting regime has just been really completely overhauled. So we're moving to a plan-led system. We've had one successful auction in Tunnua in this South Coast Designated Marine Area Plan area. Frankly, I feel the government and the industry are still feeling their way into this, and we also have other aspects to consider, like the transmission grid operator. They're going to become an offshore asset operator as part of this plan-led regime. So they're going to build two offshore substations on the Tunnua site, and there's an awful lot of aspiration. I think there's going to be a lot of lessons to learn, and one of the reasons I've engaged with Alistair and Chris is that I really feel the knowledge that's contained here in offshore wind learning, I really think that needs to be transferred as quickly as possible into the supply chain in Ireland that's going to support our ambitions. And I think having a common vocabulary and baseline level of knowledge for everybody who's in the supply chain is a great aim. So I really want to help out with that. Also, as a member of the IMREST, and almost duty bound to make sure that knowledge is brought into Ireland and made available to people who come looking for it. So I'll turn it back there. But if there's any further questions on how things are going in Ireland, you can message me or put in a follow-on question. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you, Ronan. Really helpful. And we've got one last question on the list. The status of current and potential new offshore wind projects in UK waters. Do you want to have a go at that, Chris?
Yeah, we can. Well, I mean, we touched on that a little bit in your presentation. Really, we're at 16.6 gigawatts. So it's the largest in Europe, second only to China, which is racing ahead with its capacity. A number of projects under construction. Alistair presented the sort of forward look of capacity by year. So for once, the UK looks like it's got a steady and stable pipeline, which it certainly hasn't always had. And quite often it's sort of relied on a mixture of European projects in the North Sea, sort of making a consistent pipeline for the supply chain. But we're now starting to see what looks like a very consistent pipeline just for UK projects. I mean, in terms of targets, it's similar to what Ronan said, really. We have a target of 50 gigawatts by 2030, which obviously isn't going to happen. Targets, it seems, in offshore wind are designed not to happen, because I don't think in my experience in this industry, I've ever seen a target be met. Perhaps China is the only one that would perhaps argue meet its targets, but it doesn't actually set targets. It just, as Alistair alluded to before, it sets a plan, and then it delivers against that plan. So we in terms of new capacity, we had the round 5, the sort of Crown Estates allocation last year, I think, and then talking about round 6. We don't really know what the shape of that will be, but it would need to be pretty large if we are to make a dent in towards the targets. So I think we can expect to see the industry, continuing to grow about 2 to 3 gigawatts a year for the next decade in the UK. And yeah, there's some interesting aspects of that in terms of floating now starting to come. As I mentioned earlier, the Greenvolt project in Scotland is the one that my eyes are on. But we also have some, political headwinds to accommodate. We should say we have, a party polling high at the moment in Reform, who are publicly stated to cancel offshore wind in the UK. So that is a very real political risk for offshore wind in the UK, and certainly the developers have that in mind, that there is they need to make sure their legal position around their projects is extremely robust, because what we've seen happen in America could well be attempted to happen in the UK. And so there's a real focus on sort of making sure there is a firm legal basis for consent decisions and contract for differences in order to keep the UK on track. We will get an allocation round 8 in before a new government is in place in the UK, but whether we get allocation round 9 is a bit more marginal. So I think there's a lot of work going on to try and make sure that allocation round 9 comes in while we still have the current government and doesn't slip over into being exposed to a potential Reform government.
One thing I'd add is, after allocation round 7, as I said, 25 gigawatts or so was bid in and 8.4 was won. A couple of projects looked at the prices that had been won and just concluded they could never get to that sort of number. So they handed those leases back. That is perfectly normal in a market. Attrition, as it's called. And it's a way that a pipeline of projects gets more and more upgraded as the less viable projects stand aside. So don't be put off when you see a project has been cancelled. That's not because offshore wind's not good, just that project for that company at that time is no longer viable. Okay, I think we're tidying up now.
Yep.
Thank you very much for your time here, and we hope you find these useful. We're happy to have any feedback as to how we do this, how often we do this. And Chris, do you want to say goodbye?
Yeah, thanks everybody. And we did actually record this. I should have said at the start, but for some of our members who are in inappropriate time zones for this time of meeting. So we intend to put this on the website and make it available for them. So if anybody has any objections to that, please do let me know. But yeah, all good. Thank you.
And have a great weekend.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alistair, Chris.
Thank you.